and thank you to Professor Winkir for the very kind introduction. I just want to also say thank you to you. It's really an honor and pleasure for me to come to Taiwan and do the presentation with so many students from Taiwan. And I just want to say that this is the first time I went to Taiwan. I arrived 3 days ago, or was it 2 days ago, the jet lag, so the time lag is a bit difficult, but yeah, I arrived on Tuesday night, and so far it has been really a great time, and everyone was so kind to me, and the hospitality of everyone was amazing, and I met many very friendly people, so thank you also for this warm welcome in your country, which has been really a great experience. And this is unfortunately my last day here. I'm going to Taipei later on to do a bit of sightseeing, so I look forward to explore a bit more, and then tomorrow night I'm going back to the United Kingdom. But just to say thank you as well for coming. So so the presentation, I heard that you are working on George Orwell's novels and some other work by Orwell, and I think some of you might have already started reading Orwell's novels Animal Farm and 1984, but I think you might start this in the next couple of weeks, so some of you might not have started actually looking at these books. So in the presentation I'm not going to discuss the content of the books in much detail. What I want to do is to pick up some of the topics that are important in the books by Orwell, some of the kind of themes, if you like, and relate them to our society today, to make some connections between what Orwell wrote in his novels, which are kind of a prophecy for a potential society, if you like, and I make some arguments that if we look at our societies today, and I'm speaking about the context, the kind of a Western context, say like the United States or United Kingdom or Germany, where I'm from, which is kind of a democratic society. But I say nonetheless, although we have democratic societies, nowadays there might be some features or some development in these societies, negative development if you like, that resembles what Orwell said also in his books about the society in the books. So I want to make this connection, and it might sound strange to make this connection because we think Orwell envisioned something like a dictatorship or a totalitarian society, and we are living in relatively free societies, but I think some aspects we see at the moment, and you might just think about Donald Trump in America and other aspects of fake news, and these are things that Orwell also mentioned in a way, but using maybe different terminology. So I want to kind of unpack this in the presentation, and I hope it's useful for your study then of the books later on, 1984 and Animal Farm. But as I said, I will not say so much about the content, and I know that you are going to read them anyway. I want to say a bit more about our societies in relation to that. So that is a bit of an introduction. So you can see these are the first editions of the novels by George Orwell, 1984 and Animal Farm, which were published a long time ago, shortly after the Second World War, in 1949 and in 1945 when Animal Farm was published. So it's a long time ago, and I'm mainly talking about 1984, but I also have some references to Animal Farm. So just to give a very brief context about 1984 as a starting point. Usually 1984 is a so-called dystopian novel envisioning a kind of potential society that does not exist today, but which might exist at some point in time. Or we could think, well, what Orwell describes in the book, this could be a reality in some other contexts, if you like. And I think if you look at 1984, he looks at a very dark society, which you might want to call a dictatorship or a police state, a totalitarian regime where people are not free, they cannot They are not allowed to express their views as they like. They're controlled by the secret police. They're controlled by the government. They're not free. And there are all kinds of mechanisms that are used to kind of subjugate the population. And there are some things like Orwell depicts what we might call surveillance. So the state or the secret police tries to listening in what people do in their lives to find out what they do and to see if there are any what they might call subversive activities. And they spy on the people and they might imprison them or to kill them even if they do anything that the state or that is not in favor of the state, if you like. So surveillance is a very large topic in 1984, and they use, of course, a different technology because the book was written in the 1940s. So what Orwell knew about technology was kind of based off the technology at the time, but nonetheless, surveillance was almost everywhere if you look at 1984. And I suppose this relates to other mechanisms of controlling people. Of course, there's something which Orwell might call thought control, how to control what other people think and say. And there was something called the memory hole, where inconvenient facts or perspectives that the state doesn't like, they will be put away into a memory hole so nobody can know about them. And that's a form of censorship or manipulation. And we can also think of the term propaganda that we might know in our contexts. But certainly this again is an important part of the novel. If you read it later on, you will see that manipulation of what people think, what they can say, what they can write, is really controlled by way of using different devices. And you have a few there. Of course, coercion or intimidating people by the threat or the use of violence that they keep in line is also discussed in 1984. So rather than just using, say, propaganda or surveillance to control people, they also might use violence, like in a dictatorship, use violence so that people obey orders and do what the government wants them to do and are kind of subjugated to their individual lives without having much say in a democratic way, if you like. So we might want to say that what Orwell depicts in 1984 is a kind of totalitarian society where people are controlled through various devices. They are not free, and it's really a dark novel, of course brilliantly written and put together, and relevant because many people said what Orwell depicts in 1984 is something that has actually happened. So often when you look at 1984, some scholars say, well, if we look at countries that have existed since then, there might be some countries that have the same features, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. And later I want to say that nowadays, unfortunately, our societies, while we are there's not much coercion in our society, we are relatively free to do what we like, but there might be other aspects that relate to that. You might want to think of surveillance, for instance. So if I go on Facebook with my mobile, which is here, now if I switch it on, maybe somewhere in the company of the mobile phone or Google, they know that I'm here on the campus because I might have put it on my Facebook notification, as you probably know, right? So if I say now I go on Google Maps, I put in Taichung and University campus and maybe some location data. Google Maps, they store this information and they know that I'm here. What happens if say the German Secret Service gets this information? They know that I'm here. That's surveillance, if you like. So that's something you might find in a different way in the novel as well. And there are loads of other examples of surveillance. So we come to this later, but you see there is some connection already. I didn't say much about who rules in 1984. So in our society, supposedly, the people are ruled, right, in a democracy. And of course, in 1984, you have a kind of a party that rules over the people in through various ways. And again, you might think, is this an example of, say, the Communist Party in China? Is there a resemblance? But you can also think of powerful forces in our society so there might be forces in our society that have more power than we have. So maybe if you're very rich, if you own a big company like Google, maybe you have more power than if you're like me, just an academic, and you come to do a few talks, but not having a big impact like Google has. So maybe there are similar things going on in our society, but I'll come to that later as well. So that was a bit of context about 1984 very briefly, and I know that you will read the book later on. So what I want to do now is to make some links between the book and our societies, and I'll just quickly explain how I do that. Just before that, here's some examples of what in the past scholars have said about 1984 and how it might relate to other societies. So if you look in the literature where other people have written about 1984, often it is seen as a warning against the former Soviet Union, which was, as you probably know, a totalitarian, politically centralist state. Some might say a communist state, but again, what communism has different meanings, and it might be a bit broad brush to say that. But certainly, the Soviet Union is often it's often said this had some features of 1984. It was a totalitarian state controlled by a party as well. There was a lot of coercion, violence against the people, even surveillance. The secret services used surveillance and so on. So if people think of 1984 and whether it was realized in reality, they often think, maybe, in the Soviet Union, you can see there is a picture of the Soviet Union. This is Vladimir Putin, so some people might even say today there's a connection that Russia today also has some authoritarian features that might resemble what's happening there. I'm coming from Germany, as Professor Wink here said, and as you know, Germany until 1990 was divided between East and West Germany. And East Germany was also a politically centralist government, a communist state, and some people say that this is a picture from East Germany here, which is a bit similar than Russia, was closely allied with Russia as well. That some people say that also was a bit similar or had some resemblances with 1984 because, for example, in East Germany, the secret services, there were a few million people working for the secret services and they used surveillance on a massive scale. So here, this is a picture from a film called The Life of Others, which is about life in East Germany before the 1990, and this is the main actor of the film, and you see he has these headphones. He works for the secret services, and he taps into telephone by other people, and this happened on a massive scale to control people by surveillance. And at the time, that was way before we had mobile phones and digital technology. They tapped into analog telephone communication largely to listen into, spying into what people were doing. And if people were, say, if they were talking on the phone and they tried to organize or to say to form a protest, and if they heard that, they would go and arrest them. So these things happened on a large scale in East Germany, that people who tried, say, to demonstrate or to do any other form of political activity that was against the Communist Party, they were imprisoned if the party found out, and they used surveillance to actually spy onto people to see if they did anything that would question the official kind of party and power, people in power, if you like. So again, some people might say, while the Eastern Germany was not the same as what Orwell thought about a society in 1984, certainly some of the aspects were similar. And so people might have said, well, Orwell was really smart because in the 1940s he already envisioned that if communism is put into practice in a wrong way, if you like, it might lead to something that he found and envisioned in 1984, like it did in the Stalinist societies, say, of East Germany or of the Soviet Union at the time. And maybe some people might even make a link to China as well. But that's something you might be able to better judge than me, then, because I'm not so much familiar with Chinese society, I have to admit. But you can see, like, if you think of 1984, there's largely the assumption that what Orwell depicted there resembles totalitarian communist societies, what we might call politically centralist societies, which are dictatorships, which are controlled by a minority party, which are not free, where people are not allowed to speak freely, to assemble or to write what they like, to publish independent newspapers or television casts and so on. This is all oppressed in these societies, and this is also partly what Orwell wrote about. Obviously not in the same way, there's a lot of differences as well, but I hope you get the point that I want to make. So now, the tricky thing is that I'm going to make the argument that our society, and especially I'm coming from a Western context, so I speak about the US, UK, and Germany, if you like, because I know more about these societies. I'm not so sure how much this would be true for Taiwan. Again, that's something for you to think about, but I certainly would argue that if you look at Germany, the United Kingdom, or the United States of America particularly, some aspects of these societies nowadays resemble what Orwell depicted in 1984. And you might wonder now, whoa, what could this be? So I want to show you some examples in a minute. But before I do that, I also want to quote George Orwell, because he himself, when he was still alive, said that he thinks what he depicts in 1984 could also happen in our society. So he said himself, well, because at the time when 1984 was published, many people said, well, this is Soviet Union. That was during the Cold War in the early 1950s. So many people said, well, what Orwell depicted in 1984 is like the Soviet Union. And they asked him about that when he was still alive. But then he said, wait a minute, yeah, it could be in the Soviet Union, but also it might be in our societies. And Orwell was from Britain, so he referred to his society mostly. So I just want to give you some bits from George Orwell. He said, I think this is from the 1940s, I think something like 1984 could happen. This is the direction in which the world is going at the present time. That's when the Cold War started in the 1940s and after the Second World War. He also says, specifically, the danger lies in the structure imposed on socialist and on liberal capitalist communities by the necessity to prepare for total war with the Soviet Union, and the new weapons, of which, of course, the atomic bomb is the most powerful and the most publicized. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is simple: don't let it happen, it depends on you. So what you want to say is, he says with socialist, he meant communist societies like the Soviet Union, and with liberal capitalist, he meant societies like Britain, the US, and I presume Taiwan is also a liberal capitalist society in a way. So he said there was a danger in the structure of these societies, socialist but also liberal capitalist democracies. They had a part of their structure, there was a danger, structurally speaking, that something negative could happen. And he at the time, I suppose, thought about the Cold War, when you know that there was massive military mobilization and the threat of a nuclear kind of exchange between the US, the Western Bloc, and the Soviet Union. And he thought, well, this is not just something that maybe was happening out of necessity, I guess. He might have meant that there were some issues in our societies as well. Why are we doing this weapons race against the Soviet Union? There might be underlying factors which are totalitarian in a way. Militarism, for instance, and I'll come to that later. And he said, he also said that when you look at 1984, it plays in Oceania, it's called, but I think he said that he meant basically Great Britain. Is that right? Right? So he basically meant Great Britain, although he called it Oceania. He said in an interview later, he did lay 1984 into the context of kind of Great Britain because he thought it could happen in Great Britain as well. And he also said, don't let it happen, it depends on you. And you see there, I cut out a sentence because I didn't want to give you such a long quote. What he also said, one problem was that as intellectuals and as students, you are intellectuals as well. As academics, we are the intellectuals, if you like. He said, if something negative happens, those of us who study society, the intellectuals, we have the obligation to do something about it and say something about it. So I suppose my ethical approach in a way is also to be critical about my own society because as an intellectual we should be critical about our own society because we are studying the society. Who, if not us, can say something about the society? Because if you work in a different context, you might not study society. So if we study it, we have maybe a moral responsibility to say something about our society if there is something negative going on, if you like, something like Orwell would have said. And that's why he mentioned, don't let it happen, it depends on you, actually speaking to the intellectuals. So I suppose keeping also in line with that tradition, I'm very critical about my own societies in a way. And that doesn't mean that I don't like my societies. I like America and the United Kingdom and Germany, but I think as a citizen it's my moral responsibility to be critical if I find something which is going on there which is not right, if you like. And that's, I think, well in line with what Orwell did in his work as well. Obviously, Orwell much more sophisticated than I could ever be in my presentation. But I just want to take this as a role model, if you like. So for this presentation, basically, the main argument, as mentioned, is that what Orwell depicts in 1984, and also to some extent in Animal Farm, I haven't spoken much about the other novel, Animal Farm, which also is a kind of depicts the Soviet Union in a way. And you're looking at Animal Farm later, but what I'll say is what Orwell depicts in these novels can happen in our societies. And I want to give you some examples of that. And that's why I say, my presentation is called We're Living in an Age of George Orwell at the moment, because some of the things he mentioned in the 1940s are now becoming more relevant than ever. One thing is surveillance, of course, and I come to that later on. So what I have is three themes. Propaganda and fake news, that's an issue which Orwell discusses in 1984 using other terminology like censorship or memory hole. I will talk about, well, what is the relevance of propaganda and fake news in our societies? And I would say it's very strongly going on and pervasive, and that relates to 1984. Then I come to surveillance, which is, I suppose, the most prominent theme in Orwell's book 1984 that relates to our society. So I say a bit about surveillance and how frequent surveillance is in our society, how determining it has become in the last 20 years. And then finally, a very shorter section talks about militarism. In 1984, the countries Orwell envisioned, they are engaged in kind of different alliances and wars and conflicts, and militarism is an important part of that, using military power to threaten violence and to engage in violence and so on. And I'll make the argument that our societies are also, militarism is a great part of our societies, unfortunately. And the way I'm doing this, I have three kind of sections in the presentation. At the beginning of each section, I will quote from George Orwell as a kind of reference point. And then I use this quote as a lens to say what he said in this quote, that's relevant, and I give you some evidence for that, I suppose, to kind of make the connection between Orwell's work and what's going on in our societies today. With our societies, I speak largely about British American societies and Germany a bit, but I think that accounts for many democracies nowadays. So it's a bit of a kind of challenging undertaking and maybe thought-provoking, because it's not something we always think about when we think of our society. So I come to propaganda, and you know, with Donald Trump, you know that he always uses the term fake news. And I don't want to go into fake news and what it means and what's the difference, but I'm making the claim that basically fake news is the same as propaganda. And so I take this as a similar. And of course, propaganda has many different varieties of it, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But in essence, fake news is quite the same as propaganda. And while we think now with Donald Trump, it's very obvious, you know, that what Trump says often is fake news. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Trump, but I think that's the case. And that's very obvious to all of us, right? But you might think there are many other examples that are also propaganda and fake news, which might not be as obvious as Trump, because Trump is probably not smart enough to hide his fake news in a way that they might be more effective, whereas other propaganda is far more effective, and I'll show you some examples. And I will say that's basically also fake news, but we might not be aware of it, because propaganda and fake news only work if we are not aware of them, because if we know it's fake news, we don't believe it. So what's the point? So why does everyone know that Trump is producing fake news? We don't believe him, and you know, it's probably not so effective for him, although he has a lot of power, so he probably doesn't care. But what if there's propaganda and fake news and we don't realize it? Then we might get manipulated and far more effectively. And I want to go towards that direction, if you like. So, just quickly give you something from Orwell to see, because Orwell again made interesting points, and then I come to propaganda and fake news. So this is from Animal Farm. There was an Animal Farm, as I said, is like 1984, often seen as a novel depicting the Soviet Union and or totalitarian state. But in Animal Farm there was a foreword by Orwell, an introduction, if you like. And in the introduction, Orwell basically said that he spoke to the readers who were the British people at the time, or the Western audience, and he said, well, I just paraphrase him now, and you see this is a quote from Chomsky, who looked into the foreword by Orwell. He basically said, well, when you read Animal Farm, yeah, it's about Stalinism and the Soviet Union, but you know, don't get too excited about it, because in your own societies the same stuff goes on, but you're probably not aware of that, he said to his audience. So he said, in free England, these ideas can be suppressed without the use of force, like in the Soviet Union. The sinister fact about literary censorship in England, Orwell wrote, is that it is largely voluntary. Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without any need for any official ban. So what he said is, in Animal Farm, or in 1984, in the totalitarian society, you have a very powerful government that controls what people say and think by using force or very kind of direct measures. But he says, well, if you look at England, people might voluntarily censor themselves because there might be other reasons why they do that. Indirect censorship, he calls it. So he is very critical about his own society at the time, and he writes this in the foreword. Now the interesting thing is, the foreword did not appear with the book later on, and there was some rumor that it might have been censored as well, his own foreword. But what the point I want to make is that already Orwell pointed out something like what you might put in the realm of propaganda and fake news. Yeah, and that's relevant for him in his books and for a totalitarian society, but you know, be clear about it, it's also relevant for us in a liberal democracy. And so I want to use this as a reference point to say Orwell mentioned that, but I give you now some more illustrative examples to show you why it might be relevant in our society. So just as a start, what is propaganda? So nowadays, in our understanding, what we have, if we think propaganda, often we think it's very crude. So I mentioned already, this is Trump and Putin, which is obviously not a real picture. Nowadays, when we think of fake news and propaganda, we think, yeah, Russia does it, Trump does it. So this is old propaganda from Russia here. You see these posters, they're used to mobilize the people to go to war, I presume in the Second World War. And this is understood as propaganda. This is from the German Nazis in the 1930s. A propaganda picture. Again, it is widely assumed that propaganda was very important in the dictatorship of the Nazis, the German Nazis, before and during the Second World War. And many people, if they think about propaganda and fake news, yeah, the Nazis were pioneers, they did a lot of propaganda. So you could say a common understanding is that propaganda is a thing of the past. It was in these societies, but it's not part of our societies, if you like. But is that really true? So this is another propaganda poster from this is Adolf Hitler, and this is from the Nazis, and obviously this is the worst dictatorship, or one of the worst dictatorships you could think of, which did probably the crime of the 20th century conducted by the Nazis, the Holocaust and the Second World War. So this was one of the most totalitarian regimes of all time. And Germans are certainly very critical and not at all proud about this history, which is really shameful for German people. to give you a bit of context. But what I want to look at is here the propaganda aspect, and to get us to think about, well, what is actually propaganda? So if you look at this poster, which is Adolf Hitler, and you see the swastika there, right? And you know that this was, the Nazis used this very often, right? I think you know that probably. But I'm also quite sure you know that swastika in different contexts, right? So do you know these kind of signs from Asian context? Yes? So it's far older than the Nazis, isn't it? The Nazis didn't invent the swastika, right? They did not invent it, right?
It's Buddhist.
Yeah, isn't it a Buddhist? But how comes, yeah, just the other way around, right?
Yeah.
But what did the Nazis do that everyone associates the swastika with the Nazis? So in Germany, most Germans, they might not know that the swastika has something to do with Buddhist tradition. I mean, maybe researchers know about that, or maybe people who are familiar with Buddhism or related kind of approaches might know it. But you could argue many ordinary Germans who only know about the Nazis because they study it in school, they think this is just the Nazis. So if I see a swastika somewhere, I'm just thinking, oh my God, Nazis, because I mean we don't want to be associated with them, you know. But obviously that's a problem. But why is it that we associate it? Do you know, what do you think is the reason why many Germans think the swastika is Nazis, or maybe even many people in other countries in the world? What kind of technique did the Nazis use? What does it mean, this using a label like this? Do you know this from a different context, using labels? What about this label? Do we all know this? This is Nike, right? So how do you call this Nike?
Swoosh, yeah.
What is that?
The swoosh.
Yeah, and what is the kind of, if you have a category for this, many brands have similar things, right? So is it branding? So what the Nazis did, branding. That's their brand. The Nazi brand used the swastika. They had it here, the Nazis, when they had a uniform, they had a swastika here. Everyone saw the swastika, they knew that's a Nazi, that's their brand. Every poster on the big Nazi rallies, they have the swastikas, it's their brand. That you associate the Nazis with the swastika. Maybe even at the time, people like to use it because it's a brand for them, it has a connotation. So what I'm saying is, the Nazis did this on purpose because they studied branding. So when the Nazis came into power, they thought about how can we control our population. One reason to do this is to use propaganda techniques, but at the time propaganda was called different. I mean, was a positive term, and branding, advertising, if you like, was part of propaganda. So that's why I show you the Nike symbol. So this is one of the first books on propaganda written in 1920 by a scholar called Edward Bernays. And basically, if you look into that book, what propaganda is, it has a lot to do with advertising, branding, public relations. So these kind of terms that you might know, they are actually what propaganda means nowadays. So today, if you think of terms like these, advertising, branding, sponsorship, public relations, they are actually what initially people said as propaganda. So if you look into the book from the 1920s about propaganda, this one there, many of the techniques described there were used by businesses at the time to advertise their products. Branding is one example, but also other examples, public relations. So the Nazis, when they came into power, and this was used before, they wanted to get a positive, the people to like them, so they used advertising techniques to brand their image, if you like. And the Nazis got a lot of support in Germany because they used propaganda techniques which were labeled differently at the time. And the founding father of propaganda is Edward Bernays, and he even described how he changed the terminology. Because the Nazis used propaganda, and because propaganda was also used before in the First World War, many people thought, for good reasons, that propaganda is problematic because it's manipulation. So Edward Bernays said, propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans, because they used it. So what I did was to find some other words. So we found the words Council on Public Relations. It was probably called Council on Propaganda before. But because everyone knew propaganda is bad, they thought, let's use a different term for propaganda. They used public relations. And everyone knows today public relations. Yeah, of course, it's everywhere. But most people are not aware, or many people are not aware, that actually public relation is just a different word for propaganda. And back then, it was called propaganda, and because it was used in a negative way, they tried to find different terminology, and that's still today the case. So you could argue that if someone talks about public relations today, what they actually do is they talk about propaganda. If someone talks about branding and advertising, they talk about propaganda. And I'm not saying that this is all bad, but certainly public relations advertising might have elements of manipulation as well, as we can guess. So I give you now some examples to make this, I guess, a bit more illustrative. So some examples of propaganda to see how it relates to advertising and how it's actually used in our societies. So this is an early example. This is from the 1920s when people didn't smoke. And this goes back to Edward Bernays, the founding father of propaganda in the Western context. He made an advertising campaign to get women to smoke in the 1920s, because at the time this was new smoking, if you like. So what they did is they called cigarettes torches of freedom, and they made an advertising campaign to tell women, if you smoke, you're emancipated, you're free, it's a positive thing to smoke. And this was obviously, nowadays we would call it an advertising campaign, but it was based on the literature on propaganda. It was actually, of course, a propaganda campaign to get women to smoke. So why is that propaganda? Because they did not tell people at the time the harmful effects of smoking, right? They didn't say, you have to smoke, but if you smoke, you might get cancer. I mean, nobody would probably smoke then, that's quite clear. So they said it's torches of freedom, it's toasted. I smoke a Lucky Strike instead of eating sweets, does it say there. So this is propaganda, one example. And I think less than 5% of women smoked in the early 1920s. 10 years later or 20 years later, more than 30% in the US smoked. And some people say this related to this advertising campaign. And you can think of many similar campaigns that go on, which are based on propaganda, if you like. And we can talk about, well, I'm not saying that advertising is always bad, but you could think about there are advertising campaigns that really are more misleading than others, you know. But certainly many advertising campaigns that don't tell you much about the real properties of the product. They rather try to get us attached to a product by emotional devices, you know. So why do we have, they use sports people, famous people, as kind of testimonials for us to get like brands. This is also a bit of a manipulation, right? So why should I eat a product because a sports person eats it as well? I mean, that doesn't tell me much about the product and whether it's good or bad, if you like. And you could say that's manipulation. So that's one example, advertising, and this is an early example. Another more contemporary example, you probably know then US President Barack Obama. He had a big campaign before he got elected. He said, I'm coming, I will change the society, because you know that in the US society there were a lot of problems and still are. For instance, inequality is very high. Many people are not happy in the US. So Obama ran a campaign where he said, I'm bringing change. And you also can see that he had his little brand there. This is probably also like a sign, like a swastika, but a different branding. So everyone where you had the campaign, he might have this kind of logo, and change, we can believe in, that's the slogan. That people think, yeah, Obama, change, that's why we have to vote him. And interestingly, for his campaign, he even got a prize from the advertising industry. So in 2008, President Barack Obama was named Advertising Age's Marketer of the Year. And Advertising Age is kind of an advertising trade magazine. So you would think, well, advertising is something that businesses do, but not a political party, because politics is actually, you think it's about politics and information and programs. But actually, nowadays politics, especially in the US, but also in the UK or Germany, it's more about selling your brand without telling the people what you're actually going to do. Because if Obama had told the people that actually he's not going to redistribute wealth when he's president, which he didn't do, he's not going to change the basic structure of policies, which he didn't do, then they wouldn't have voted him. So it turned out that Obama, I mean, you can look at this in more detail, and I don't have the time to go through this, but he didn't change so much in his presidency. Basically, many people argue that Obama was quite similar to other presidents, even to George Bush, who was in office before, who was a Republican president. And many people say Obama's presidency basically continued Bush's kind of politics in a way, although he was a Democrat. So not so much change, more branding, advertising, if you like. And of course, you might disagree on that. There are many people who really admire Obama, and I don't want to just be negative about Obama, but some people say one reason why Trump got voted is that people didn't believe in the Democratic Party anymore because they didn't change anything. So why vote Hillary Clinton? Obama said he would change something, he wouldn't change anything. Do you think Clinton would have changed more than Obama? So people were really frustrated, and maybe out of protest to some extent voted Trump, because he also deceived the people, of course, but maybe at the time there wasn't any other candidate, if that makes sense. So that's another example. Just one final example. So there are many wars and conflicts, and of course propaganda is very important if you go to war. And this is an example of it. You probably know that in 2003, a coalition of the West, led by the United States and Great Britain, but including many European countries, and I believe maybe even some Asian countries as well, they said we have to go to war against Iraq, because what they said is Iraq has so-called weapons of mass destruction, they call it, like atomic, they want to produce biological and atomic weapons, and we have to stop them. We need to go to war, to intervene, to invade Iraq, to destroy their weapons, if you like. And that was used as a discourse of legitimation to actually go to war. So obviously people don't like to go to war, so you have to have a good reason if you want to go to war. And propaganda is used often. And in this case, that's Colin Powell, who was the Foreign Secretary of the US at the time. He said at the United Nations, he had this speech where he said, well, Iraq has these weapons and they can potentially attack other countries. We have to do something about that. So this is from the media at the time. So for instance, this is the New York Times on the right-hand side, which is a leading American newspaper. They very prominently carried this kind of discourse, saying that Iraq needs to be disarmed, we need to do something, and that's in the press. This is from the left-hand side, from the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, which even said Iraq is 45 minutes from attacking us. So they said Iraq could attack even Britain, although it's thousands of miles away. And people might have believed that because it was in the news all over the place. So there was even a study, and just quickly to show you that, looking at all the, at 1 month of television news in the United Kingdom, all the quality news organizations, the BBC, which you might know, the big television stations that are supposed to be objective about events. The study looked into whether they implied that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and they found on the right-hand side that 98%, nearly 90% of all news shows, I think it was in 1 month before the invasion, they implied that Iraq had the capability of using weapons of mass destruction. Only 11% doubted that this was possible, because at the time some people said, well, where's the evidence that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction? And also, what about other countries? Many countries have weapons of mass destruction. Do we just attack them because they have these weapons? I mean, there could be a problem there. But certainly in the British media, there was an overwhelming kind of majority of quality media outlets that said, that used the perspective that Iraq had these weapons. They lent credibility to it. And that goes back to politicians saying that, and they were not critical about it. It turned out, however, And this is Scott Ritter, who was working for the United Nations, and he was in Iraq before, the 10 years of the 1990s, the United Nations tried to disarm Iraq because they had some weapons programs. And he led a team that for many years was in Iraq and looked at all the facilities that Iraq possessed in terms of their military weapons and arsenal. And he said, before even Colin Powell spoke about weapons of mass destruction, he said, actually, Iraq doesn't have any weapons. We destroyed them all. And there's a video on YouTube. I don't have the time to show you that, but if you look on YouTube, Scott Ritter, he's called. He said he has a lot of evidence he provided at the time, credibly saying, well, Iraq is not a threat. And but unfortunately, what he said was not featured prominently in the news. Although he was he was one of the leading persons from the United Nations, so a credible person who said that. So again, you could argue, well, this is propaganda in a way to say that Iraq has these weapons, because it turned out that never any weapons were found in the end. So Iraq didn't have these weapons, and this was used as a justification. It was based on fake news, if you like, or propaganda. Choose the words that you might want to use. And this was widespread, the reporting in democracies, no critical scrutiny, if you like, as you would expect. I'm not sure about Taiwan, I'm sure it was reported here as well, maybe differently, but certainly in the US, UK, and Germany, not really critical. And with massive consequences, so many, I mean, if you look at Iraq and what happened, the society basically was destroyed as a result of the war. If you look at, you might have heard about ISIS, the terrorist group, it basically emerged out of the ashes of the Iraq war. There's another example which I don't show you because I don't have so much time. So that was some examples of propaganda. There are multiple more I could show you, but I want to now go to the next theme, surveillance. So this is from 1984. Orwell wrote how often or what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork, but at any rate they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. With wire they probably meant some communication system that people used. So Orwell wrote in 1984 that at any given time the police could surveil people when they used communication devices, at any given time. And I'm going to make an argument now that the American Secret Services at any given time can look into our communication as well. So if they want to look into my communication, they can do that if they want to. I'll make that argument. At this point in time, they might not do this because why would they be interested in me? But technically, if the American Secret Services wanted to, they have the capability to check everything I did online, since I came to Taiwan. If I go to get cash, they can check that because there's a digital footprint. If I use my credit card on a cash machine, that's digital. If I use Google, if I use email, if I use GPS, it's all stored online. If the Secret Service want to, they get that data, and I show you a few examples of why. And that is quite similar, although the technology is much more sophisticated than Orwell would have thought of. So just to give you an example of surveillance, and I'm sure you have experienced the same. So this is a screenshot from the Guardian newspaper where this was a couple of months ago, I went on the Guardian newspaper website to look at an article. This one on the left hand side is an article on surveillance. And you see on the right hand side, there's an advertisement for a book called Social Media, and that's from Amazon. And Amazon, so you looked at the Guardian website as a newspaper, and for some reason, Amazon gave me that advertisement. And I'm sure you know this happens all the time, right? And maybe that's quite straightforward, but I'm not sure if you're aware that this is possible because of surveillance. Because some time before, I looked on Amazon into the books about social media, and I might just have searched for some books because I'm interested in it. Next time I go online, they give me an advertisement. But the implications are that somewhere online this information is stored. Somewhere online it's stored that I'm Florian, I'm interested in social media. That's stored somewhere. I don't know where, but it must be stored somewhere, because otherwise they couldn't have given me that advertisement. And this is This means someone knows that I'm interested in social media. But what about, say, if I'm looking on websites where I'm critical about the government, and I'm reading articles critical about the government? This means somewhere it's stored that I'm critical of the government as well. Technically, this is then available online, and you know, I'm looking at all kinds of other news, for instance, online. I might go shopping online. I do other things. It's stored somewhere. It's just one example. It's possible because of surveillance, because my footprint is stored online somewhere, and probably everyone's footprint. So how does it work? I just want to give you quickly the example of Google. So as you probably know, Google's main business, while we use the search engine, mostly the search engine or Gmail is the services, but Google makes money from advertisement. So 90% of the revenues that Google make is advertising revenue. And Google is the third largest amount of advertising revenue goes to Google. So a massive advertising campaign in the sense that of all global advertising spending, 1/3 in total from all companies goes to Google. So it's really widespread. But how does advertising work for Google? How do they do advertising? So there's one scholar who says Google has great customer service, but the problem is we as a user of Google's service, we are basically not the customer. Because when I'm using Google's search engine, I'm the product that Google sells to the advertisers, who are the customer, basically. That means how Google makes money, and you might be aware of that as well, is they look, say if I use Google as a search engine, they get information what I'm interested in, and then they sell this information to companies like Amazon or any other company so that they can then target their products to me, like with the example with the book. That's how they make money, basically. And they do the same with their other services as well. So it means that the business model is basically built based on surveilling what people do online. So basically my online footprint, if I use Google or other services from Google, is then used and sold to advertising clients. And think about the amount, because 1/3 of global advertising is huge then. This is one data center. There are several data centers where Google stores all the information, because obviously if over 1 billion people use Google, they need to store a lot of information, and that's one. It looks a bit like a shopping mall, and that's where they have servers. And that's another. You see that in Taiwan, they also have one of these kind of things, but they might store information from people all over the world in the Taiwan one. It doesn't mean that it's just for Taiwan, it just means it happens to be there maybe because it's just cheaper to have it there. And in Europe there's some, in England, and the US of course. So what information do they store? This is just some examples. If I use Google Chrome, they can store my whole web search history, they can store somewhere if they want to. Gmail they can store, Google Drive, all the Google products, Android and so on. And this is all part of Google. Technically they can store that information. So here's another example just to show you the implications. This is using Google. So this is a map from Liverpool in the UK where I used to live a year ago. So I went on Google and I just put in car hire on Google because I was looking for hiring a car. Then what happens is you see these AdWords here. That's different AdWords. It says ad here, meaning advertising. So if you use Google later and you search for something, it will give you some advertisings as well, especially things like car hire. So the interesting thing was I just put car hire into the Google, but then it gives me advertisements for specific companies in the area of Liverpool. So they gave me that map. It gave me different locations for stores in Liverpool where I live. So again, Google knew that I live in Liverpool. They knew maybe other things as well. So again, why did Google know this? Again, because before that I used Google and other devices and I searched things in Liverpool and I lived there for a while. So Google knows that. Again, I I don't know what else they know, but certainly they know that I was living in Liverpool. And why do they know this? Because they stored the information from my previous searches, if you like. So of course I don't want to just be critical about Google. You could say that it's a business model and Google has not the intention to give our private data to anyone else. They don't want to do that, and it's private information. I think by law they can't do that. So I don't want to say it's just bad, because of course if I get an advertising for a good book, I might be happy about it because I don't know about the book. So yeah, it's maybe even also, it has good sides as well. I don't want to say it's all bad, you know. But I suppose the question is, this has implications for our privacy as well. So is this really right that they have this information and we don't know where it is? And so you can call this economic surveillance, it's business surveillance. It might be positive in a way, but on the other hand you could say, well, this is huge. It's maybe more than Orwell would have envisioned. Certainly if you look at the former East Germany, when they tapped into telephones there, where people were very critical about at the time, that's nothing compared to this kind of surveillance. And just quickly to add on that, so where is then the real danger? So you might have heard that there was what is called the NSA scandal. This is Edward Snowden, who in 2013 went to Hong Kong, and he worked for an American security company that was, I think, an intelligence service as well. And he had documents from this intelligence service showing that the American NSA, the National Security Agency, a big intelligence branch, that they basically were able to tap into Google and other companies to get the data. And that's why I said before that if the Secret Service want to, they can get my information, because Snowden, he leaked documents that demonstrate that the American intelligence services, they can, if they want to, obtain the data from Google, because they just go in their system, which is of course questionable. But that's what broadly speaking, the NSA scandal was about, that it came out, he's a whistleblower, he was working in the system, it came out that actually the secret services, they try to get our data from these big companies. So all the data that the companies store for advertising purposes only, of course, these secret services say, well, it's advertising, but well, it has some other use for us, because if there are bad people around, well, why not check what they're doing online? We might find them, we can arrest them. And you know, you could say, okay, there might be a valid argument if you want to get criminals, it might be valid to look for their footprint. On the other hand, it turned out that they were just looking at far more people than criminals. So what Snowden found out is that actually they could look at anyone worldwide, and I'll show you some examples to make that clear. So this is just the press reporting at the time. Everywhere in the news, maybe also in Taiwan, we heard about the NSA scandal. This is the NSA, the building where they're situated in Utah. The NSA, one of the NSA data centers, and here from the aerial photography in Utah in the United States. So basically, the NSA, the Snowden, he provided documents suggesting that the American Secret Service NSA and the British GCHQ, they access emails, voice over IP chats, videos, IP addresses stored by firms like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook. So all the information we store online, basically, these intelligence services, they access them. Obviously, the legal issue is a completely different thing here. And also they found that the British GCHQ, if you look in Britain, as an island, below Britain there's the Atlantic Ocean, there's a big global phone and internet cable going, like a backbone, connecting Europe and the US with the internet. This cable goes through the Atlantic there, and basically they tapped into that backbone there as well. And they have names like, there's one program called Mastering the Internet and Global Telecoms Exploitation. That's how the Secret Services call their program. So just to hear, you know, the terminology they're using, mastering the internet, meaning basically they get on top of what's going on online, and they try to tap into all the data. Even phone calls, emails. You might have heard that German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they tapped into her phone as well. that came out at one point in time. And also, this is maybe the worrying thing, they were able to store metadata for up to 30 days from what people might have done online. So these are just some examples, and if you look at the Guardian website, for example, they have loads of different stories about this, what they all did in terms of surveillance. So this is from the Guardian. They said for the 2 billion users of the internet, the surveillance program called Tempora represents a window on their everyday lives, sucking up every form of communication, meaning the intelligence services sucking up all the information. This is all being carried out without any form of public acknowledgement or debate, because people didn't know that. Snowden brought this to the attention of the public. Massive surveillance, that's, you could say, is Orwellian. Age of Orwell, surveillance. Big Brother, the term he uses in 1984, is watching you. The NSA is Big Brother, if you like. Finally, this is a heat map. The darker the color, the more surveillance. This is from the intelligence services, part of the leaked document, showing that they're basically looking at every part in the world they can surveil the online structure. If it's milder in the color, like here or there, it's less surveillance. If it's red, it's high surveillance, but they can go anywhere. So you see that as an example. So yeah, that was a bit on surveillance. I think I don't have much time left, right? So just to see the implications, so if you read 1984 later on, they talk about surveillance in 1984, then just think about what's going on today. And you know, I just, again yesterday I uploaded some pictures from Tunghai University on my Facebook. I'm also using Facebook and everything because, I mean, yeah, it's a good application, but sometimes you might be aware that this information is stored. And I don't want to say that they just look into you or me and so on, but technically you could argue if they wanted to, they might have the means to tap into what I'm doing, for example, if they wanted to. If they were thinking, well, we want to look what he's doing, they might be able to look into some of my footprints of the last couple of weeks or so. I don't know, certainly 30 days if it's true what the Guardian reported there. So just finally, very briefly, militarism is another topic. So we might think that we are actually living in a more peaceful age, right? The Second World War, and since then we have been in a more peaceful age, which is good because the Second World War was obviously initiated by Germany and devastating. Germany, like the main aggressor, of course. But again, in 1984, militarism is very prominent because there's a constant war between different countries or continents, if you like. But in 1984, the people are not aware of that because of the propaganda and manipulation. People seem not to be aware of the constant permanent war state. So Orwell, in his book, he has this kind of prominent phrase, war is peace, meaning there is war going on all the time, but it's depicted, it's called peace, and people then think it's peace, but there is no war in a way, so it's kind of propaganda manipulation. So I want to give you some example of why we are also living in an age where war is very determining, although we might think we are having peace right now. And I mean, I know about the context in Taiwan, I'm sure that we don't see any war here, but there might be, you know, we have the issue with North Korea, for instance, going on at the moment in the US and so on. So these are, of course, military confrontations in a way, or pre-military confrontations, but I would say there's more going on, real war, and we might not be aware of that. And I'll give you some examples. So this is military spending of the United States, and you see it's about, this is from 2008, but you can just see it's huge, $650 billion annual military spending, and it has even increased since then, which is half of the budget of the US. So think about it. What do they do with that military spending? It's applied in war in a way, and I'll give you some examples of how. So this is what you call a war economy. It's an economy based on military spending. Half of the budget is used for military spending, including hardware and of course technology, but also weapons and so on. And so to think we are in a peaceful age, then, well, that's a bit of a kind of contradiction here if you have high military spending, at least if you think of the US context, which in US is a leading country of the Western world, many people say. So yeah, where's the money brought to? This is American bases overseas. Red dots is country with military bases. So Germany has a lot of military bases from the US, but you see it's everywhere worldwide. I mean, I don't know, I suppose for some countries it might be beneficial to have security provision by the US, for others it might not be. So think about the Soviet Union here, which is encircled by American bases. People might think that Vladimir Putin is an aggressor, but the Ukraine, the US has just put a lot of, and NATO as well, including Germany and European forces, they just have put a lot of forces near Ukraine. And the US, the Russians are really worried about that, because in the Second World War the Nazis came through the Ukraine to get into Russia, and Russia had the largest toll in the Second World War was Russians. So the Russians suffered the most in the Second World War. Germans came through the Ukraine. Now NATO is at the border of the Ukraine, so actually Russia is quite worried about that. And that's militarism, if you like. That's the final stage before a war. I don't want to be too kind of negative about it, but if you're in Europe and you see these bases and you think of Russia that's encircled in a way, that's not necessarily a good situation. And in 1984, I guess Orwell writes about these kind of tensions between different continents and that were engaged in war, and this looks quite frightening in a way. So I'm making the argument, and this is from a book chapter I did, that we are living actually more in an age of war than peace. So just some facts, and this is again the Western context. So since it's the end of the Second World War, the US and UK have used their military forces in other countries literally every year, and often we don't hear about that. It might be small operations and we don't know about them because they're applied in secrecy. Richard, who you mentioned at the beginning in his book, he wrote that in 1982 there was a war between Britain and Argentina, a relatively short one, but that was the 88th deployment of British troops since 1945. Again, this is a lot of military operations, and we're not aware of this that this is happening. Then just some more context. Yeah, this is again President Obama. So we think that Donald Trump is frightening, rightly so. But what about Obama? He won the Nobel Prize, the Peace Nobel Prize, and I think that's an interesting example of kind of using war as a kind of shield, or using peace as a kind of shield for war. Because Obama wasn't as peaceful as many might think in his foreign policy. So I showed you the picture of branding Obama and change, but actually his foreign policy was quite aggressive, not different from other American presidents. To give you some examples, Obama in his 8 years in office was engaged in 7 simultaneous wars, and we might not be aware of that. So you might know that the US forces are still in Afghanistan, for example, major war, longer than the Vietnam War. US forces were in Syria, and drones used in Yemen and Pakistan and other theaters. So 7 wars that Obama was engaged in, not really worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize, I would think. Special forces, American secret special forces or operations at the moment in 135 countries employed worldwide, and also largely in secrecy. And if you look at the drone war that Barack Obama has been fighting, and this goes still on with Trump, about 2,400 people were killed by drones by the US when Obama was in office, most of them civilians, and this was done officially to get rid of terrorists, but I mean, you see the implications, again, not a sign of peace. So I suppose these are just some data, and I could go on with that demonstrate that actually war is quite determining, at least in the Western context. So Western states spend huge sums on military. They use the military in distant countries, often third world countries, and we don't hear much about that. Sometimes you have bigger operations like in Iraq, but often we're not hearing about these secret or silent wars that Richard calls them like that. So that's a bit a sign of war, not peace, and I think with Orwell you could say, well, war is peace still makes sense today because it's sold to the public, again using misinformation, fake news. We think we are living in a quite peaceful age. Of course, if we are here or in Europe, for us it's quite peaceful, but if you think of the other countries where we bring our military forces, for them it's not as peaceful, so worth to think about that. So, as a very brief conclusion, I just want to say that, of course, I don't say that everything is the same as in 1984. This is just, I guess, some indications that I would say some aspects of 1984, and you can read it yourself, they are relevant for us if we think critically about our own societies in a way. And it's not the same, we are very free in terms of what we can do and what we can say, but there might be some powerful actors who try to constrain that, using surveillance, using propaganda, deceiving people to do other things that we would normally not like them to do, our governments. So think about, say, the American budget they use for their military forces. Many people in the US might not want their taxes to be used in that way. Why not using it for healthcare or social services, you know? So you need to use propaganda in order to enable this amount of military spending and so on. So I think this resembles to some extent some of the deception we see in 1984. And of course there's much you could talk about that in many aspects it's of course different as well. But I would claim that, and you know that Orwell wrote a lot also on contemporary affairs, and he was a journalist. He was very critical about Britain and also about the Soviet Union and other countries and their policies. And I would make the claim, and of course other people might disagree with that, but I would make the claim that Orwell would not be surprised that what's going on today resembles things that he had in 1984. And I think the most striking example, of course, is the massive surveillance that is going on at the moment. And I suppose if we follow Orwell, we might want to think about ways of trying to kind of regulate that to actually get some legal changes that legal kind of or laws that constrain the ability of governments and secret services to tap into that information. Some people even say you should just get rid of these intelligence services so that they are not enabled anymore to tap into these kind of softwares or into our footprint. But we might also want to think about whether it's good to give very big corporations like Google and Facebook a monopoly over search engines or networking websites so that they store all the data in a very centralized fashion. So again, in 1984, Orwell talks about the party, a central entity that has control over everything. Aren't we creating similar bureaucracies? Why don't we have 10 or 20 different search engines that are equally used and important? Nowadays it's just, I mean, there are some other search engines, but largely Google, at least in the Western context, Google is mainly used, Facebook is mainly used, and YouTube is mainly used, Instagram is mainly used for pictures and so on and so forth. So why is it that we just have 1 or 2 or 3 applications for all the different domains, and isn't this dangerous, centralizing all the information in big entities? Again, maybe a connection to what Orwell wrote. But yeah, I hope this gives you some stimulating thought, thinking about our society from as critical scholars and students, and maybe trying to make the society better in the spirit of George Orwell, who said, as mentioned at the beginning, it's our task to prevent these things from going on. We are citizens in democracy, so we should do something. So I'm sounding a bit like I guess like an advocate here, but I think that's important, and I want to finish on that note because, yeah, that's what I think Orwell would have believed in as well. So yeah, thanks for listening. I hope this was useful to hear for you.